Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of The Democratic View. My name is Phyllis Italiano, and I am the hostess, and we come to you every week with some issue that we think is very important. And today I have with me a lady who is like a Joan of Arc of our times. Her name is View-Cile Downs, and she is the founder of the Acabonic Protection Committee. I want to first ask you, before I go into anything, and I have a lot that I want to ask you, what does the word Acabonic really encompass? What is that about? Is it the body of water?
You know, I don't know what, it's an Indian word.
Yes, I know
don't
that.
know exactly what the Indians meant by it. What area was encompassed by what they called Acabonic. But it was the whole region around the creek, as far as we know.
Uh-huh. And the creek is the area where the 2 points?
Well, it's the water that's enclosed by those little spits of land.
Yes.
Across the Gardiner's Bay from Gardiner's Island, as
Yes,
our
well, it's
films always say.
a spectacular site, I might add.
Oh, it
I
is.
often drive in the wintertime and go there and take a look at it just to see it because it's really spectacular. And Seal, before we get into what you do and what your work is about, I do have to know a little bit about you because that's what my training has always been, to find out a little bit about a person who gets involved in doing some good work. And where are you born and raised?
I was born and raised in Waco, Texas.
Wow.
Well, it was kind of an ordinary place. It was very ordinary, which means that it wasn't a bad place for children to grow up. You know, there's nothing dramatic going on there then. It was just like any inland Midwestern town, for instance. So I got up to through college, remaining in Waco.
Oh,
I
really?
went to Baylor University.
Oh, that's right. It's right
Yeah,
there.
yeah.
Yes.
And I was an art student. I was in art. So I was an art major, English minor. at
From
Baylor.
Texas. That's amazing.
Well, there's a lot of reasons you might be interested in environment in Texas, you know, because it's pretty dramatic. We were close enough to the Dust Bowl that the dust would come through sometimes, but we had rain and crops continued to grow where I was.
You know, I've driven across Texas, and I was always quite, a couple of times, I'm always quite amazed at the variety of the terrain. For instance, you go through, you know, someplace like Kansas, and Kansas is Kansas. You go
That's
through
right.
Missouri. Missouri is all,
That's
you
right.
know, like the rolling
And
hills.
Texas is very stretched out from
Yes.
side to side, and it goes down into what was once the coastal jungle in the United States around the Gulf of Mexico. So there's that whole coastal thing there. And then you get up away from that, and there's a change in the terrain. It's all the bottom of the ocean, what's risen up from the bottom of the ocean, which is to say white limestone up to a point. And then suddenly you come to what's obviously of volcanic origin, and all the rocks turn red and dark brown from there on west. And you're in the geology that created the Rockies.
Really?
So that explains why there's so many vegetation zones, you know, whole different kinds of desert and plains and so on and so on. So it was kind of interesting.
So you went to Baylor, and then what happened?
Well, I went to New York, came to New York, because Texas is a long way from New York, and you really got away from your family that way. And also, it was a big destination. I'm talking about 1948. This is a long time ago. And if you went to New York, maybe you learned something, you know. And there were art things going on there and so on. So I came to New York and got a job and went to the Hoffman School, Hans Hoffman.
Oh,
and
really?
and lived down in the village, South Village. And however, I was too tired in the evening because I had to have this job, and that was because I was not subsidized to go to New York. My parents lacked the concept of sending your children someplace to enter life. They never heard of it. They didn't have very much money either. So I was struggling, and I became just all tired out. And I decided to go back home and get some further education, find a place to go and get further education. So I went back to Waco and applied to several colleges. And one of them was Iowa, where my art teacher at Baylor had gotten a doctor's degree, which was almost unheard of. Everybody laughed about that because he was German. He was German who got out of Germany along with Hans Hofmann, who was his partner in a school, long before there was a Jewish question in Germany, because artists, modern artists,
Yes.
were degenerate art.
Yes.
And so they were having a hard time, and they emigrated to the U.S., and Hoffman ended up, fortunately, in New York, and poor Edmund Kinsinger, my teacher, had to go to Baylor, which was really not the place for art at all.
No, I
So
can't
I
imagine.
went to State University of Iowa,
Yeah, Iowa State, yeah, sure.
yes, and got a master's degree, which at the time was a special kind of degree preparing you to both practice art and teach it, teach art history, for instance. So you come out of that able to teach either thing. So that's why I was there. And there I met my husband, and he was a New York boy. And so we came to East Hampton because a lot of his friends, like Peter Matheson and, you know, John Cole, there were a lot of people here that were his old buddies from childhood. So we came here. And
So
I
when
got
did you
here.
get here? When did you get to East Hampton?
54. Yeah. So,
54. I was just being introduced to Eastern Long Island. My aunt married a man who had a place, now Squires, as a matter of fact, is his name, and he had a place in Jamesport, on the North Fork. So I did see this area in those days, and I loved it. I loved it. I mean, the North Fork was nothing but farms, wall-to-wall farms. It was just extraordinary. Unfortunately, you know, of course, my father, myself, and one of my sisters, we were water people. We loved the water, and we wanted to be, you know.
Oh, wow.
My mother didn't like the water, so she never, you know, pushed my father to own anything out here. So I came and spent several summers until I was, I think 18 almost. No, 17, because then I went to work. I spent summers out in Jamesport, which was, you know, wonderful. Which is why I live here. You know. So you came out here in 54.
and you know, that was still times when it was so cheap here. It was where artists would come.
Yes.
Because
There's
it
a
was
whole
cheap
article
enough
in
to
the
have
Star.
actually to get a house.
Sure.
You know, and you could get an old farmhouse or something.
Right.
So we were able to buy some land on Acabonic Harbor. I wouldn't even want to tell you how cheap it was, but it was quite a big piece, like 21 acres, that went from Fireplace Road to the water.
I know, I've seen it, and it's absolutely extraordinary,
Yeah.
and you are
So,
quite lucky to own it in this day, because it would cost you a fortune.
Well, of course, what happened subsequently was that eventually we divorced. We built a house, that's enough to destroy any marriage, you know. They always said that. And it was true. So we got divorced and we divided everything evenly, and he got most of the land and I took the house. So my house hasn't got much land with it. But what he took, he subsequently sold to a man. And this is how the Acabonic Protection Committee got started.
That's what I want
Was
to hear.
over the issue of what was going on with that land, which is now the Barbara Hale Refuge. now. But that was his portion of the land, and it was something like 17 acres on the creek. And this Dan Weitzman misrepresented what he intended to do with the land if my husband would sell it to him. And, well, I just call that lying, you know. He lied. He said he wanted it for the 2 houses for his 2 sons. His sons never had any interest in having any houses in East Hampton. And immediately that he owned it, more or less, you know, within a year or 2, he applied for a permit to build 5 houses and a turnaround, you know, one of those roads that goes in and then it circles around and you put the little houses all around.
And the little septic systems
Oh, yes.
flowing into that water.
Fortunately, even then, and this is about 65, we're talking 65, 66, 67, in there someplace, the town would not allow such low land to be developed in that way. And they said, oh, absolutely no 5 houses. So, and then years and years went on, and he owned a great deal of real estate. That's why I thought, what a rotten deal. He's offering to buy this land. My husband never even asked his own lawyer, what does this man do for a living? He was a land speculator. That's what he did. His profession was land speculating. So he just deceived my husband, got a big bunch of it, but they weren't going to let him develop it the way he had in mind because it was already then considered too low, too close to groundwater and too close to the water.
Sure, it is.
To do that. So years went by, and he was in no hurry because he owned a whole lot of land, which he was developing here and there anyway. And meanwhile, 2 friends, I was not the one who created it alone. There were 3 of us. And one of them was Betty Franey, of blessed memory. And the other one was Elizabeth Schaffner, Perdita Schaffner's daughter. And she rented my studio for a while. And we would talk about the fate of this land and how dreadful it was, and we just wished that somehow the town could buy it. Well, of course, that wasn't a kind of program at that time. They didn't have that in mind.
No, that didn't.
And it was long before the Community Preservation Act, so that couldn't happen. But years passed. And during that time, we decided to start an organization because we saw what could happen to the creek.
Sure.
You could look at it and see. Here and there was a house right on the water. That could have been every lot along the waterfront could have had a house on it, right on the water, because then you could still do that. So the 3 of us wrote a letter to everyone we could think of and explained this and said we want to start something called the Acabonic Protection Committee. And the first meeting we had, everybody in the neighborhood came. You know, people that lived on the Ayers, who lived on the island out in the middle of the creek. People on Old Stone came. People all up and down Fireplace Road were friends of ours, and they all felt the same way we did. And so we had early meetings where the room was just full of people who lived right by Acabonic, or in the middle of it. And so we decided to go to the Springs Advisory Board, as it was called at that time. They didn't have CAC, you know, it was board. And I went in there one evening with many of these friends and explained to them what had happened with this land and how we feared that there was going to be a bunch of development right around the creek, and it would be to the great detriment of the environment and everybody's feelings about the place, which were quite strong, you know. And the advisory board stated that they totally agreed with us, you know, which was a very good start. And there's a teeny little picture in the Star of this discussion. And that's how we began.
That's wonderful.
After that, we just went on having meetings, and we had Nancy Kelly come and offer us an umbrella status, you know, that we could be umbrellaed by the group. And we said, well, we're not absolutely certain that we will always agree with the group about every little thing. So we elected to stay independent.
Oh, good thinking. Whoever
Well,
thought that?
I actually don't know. I think we probably would have fared about the same. I don't think they ever would have interfered with anything we were doing. But we had our own idea about how to begin. So that's what happened.
So what are your ideas about, what is it that your goals are for this group?
Well, the name says it.
I know it does.
Whatever you need to do to protect it as much as possible. Of course, that means you don't want it badly developed, and you want to get land acquisition wherever possible. And when the community preservation law was passed, it suddenly became possible for a big piece like what's now Barbara Hale Refuge to be bought. And I remember before that Kathy Lester and Job Potter, who was on board then, went to Albany repeatedly to beg for money from Albany, and they never got any. When we had the Community Preservation Act, we were able to have things like that actually happen, and it did. It eventually did. And then several years after that, we were working with Deb Foster, and she, you know, we said we'd like to call it the Barbara Hale Refuge in memory of Barbara Hale. It was such a big figure in our neighborhood, this self-taught naturalist who went to the school and taught the children about nature and had the children come to her house and taught them there. And it was so appropriate. So that's why that thing is called the Barbara Hale Refuge.
Aha. Oh, wow. And when did you get into making films? Because I've seen several of them.
Oh, that's relatively recent.
Well, they're wonderful, though. They're really
Well,
wonderful. We were just pointing out the one that
the Grasslands one?
the Pine Barren people, the Pine Barren Society, they showed one this last night, and it was on there in the studio hall, and all about, you know, the marshland and the flowers and the birds, and it was just breathtakingly beautiful, to the point where I said, you know, I really should start putting in more on my grounds. Now, I have a half acre, you know, and it's developed. I didn't put anything, you know, I mean, I have put a few things in, but most of the things that are there were there when I bought the property. But I was thinking to myself, because I swim down by a preserve.
Yes, and good for you.
And there's these wonderful grasses and a bush that I'm crazy about called Virginia mint, which is a gorgeous, gorgeous flower. It's like little pieces of silk held together with a little
I don't think
bottom.
I know that one.
Oh, it's gorgeous. And now it bloomed in late October. So I don't even see it this year. So I'm waiting to see if it's going to come back. But those grasses are very lovely, and I'm thinking to myself, why don't I have some of that kind of stuff? There's stuff that really comes from this area that's native. I should be doing more of that kind of stuff. One of my neighbors, who is a native landscaper, said to me, you know, you've got a, and I told you about that on the phone, you've got this vine growing all over your...
Yes, and we didn't determine what the vine
No,
was.
it was exactly what you said.
Oh, it was bittersweet.
It was bittersweet.
Okay.
And he cut it all down for me, and I was able to get rid of it, and I thought, my God, I didn't even notice this before. Now I'm looking and I see it in other little places, and I thought, well, I got to get rid of this stuff. And not only do I need to get rid of it, but you know, these things become very invasive, and they grow, and they take over even the plants that
That's
somebody
why they're
else.
called invasive plants.
That's right. That is why they're called.
My first film was on that subject, invasive plants, and what you do about them. That was the first of the whole series, and it was done with Jeannie Henderson, and more or less with a lot of help from LTV, for which I was very, very grateful.
No, I haven't seen that one. I'd like to see
You know,
it.
it's number one, it's the first one. And I thought, I think people don't know how to recognize them necessarily. They don't know which things are invasive. You know, there's things you may not like much, like poison ivy, but it's not invasive. An invasive plant actually destroys other plant life. It takes its place.
That's right.
Like Phragmites moves in,
Right.
and then the natural growth of the marsh is wiped out because it's outcompeted
Yes.
by the invader. So it was called Invaders in Paradise. And that's how I felt about the
great title.
area that we live in paradise.
Oh, that's
But-
my message
but
on my phone.
we have these invaders that march in, you know, in an almost military fashion, and just destruction ensues. And people need to know what they are and how easily they can, most of them, be destroyed. You know, it's not, sometimes it's a pretty tough
Well,
assignment.
where I know I have some bittersweet growing around some other things, and I am going to ask my neighbor if he'll help me to, as I saw what he did, he just really cut it from the bottom and pulled out. You know, and I'm going to ask him to help me with that because it needs to be done. So how many members do you think you have in your group?
It's always very hard to keep up with because they keep moving around, and when they move out of sight and we can't get a mailing to them anymore, we then delete them. So there's every time we do a mailing, there's a whole lot of deletions. Every time we do an event, we get some new members. It's awfully hard to tell how they're balancing out. So we've been around 900 for some time.
Wonderful.
And I remember when we were first beginning, what I patterned, or we patterned our group on, was CCOM, Concerned Citizens of Montauk. We thought they were just ideal. I mean, we thought what they were doing was super, and if only we could imitate that. And they had, at that time, about 900 members. And we said, oh, well, Montauk's a big place, and we'll never have any 900 members. But you see, we have reached that level, more or less. And if we now only have 870, that could be the case, but I wouldn't regard it as a sign that we're withering away.
I wonder if you realize how important groups like this really are to our town. I mean,
Oh, I think
CCOM
pretty important.
and yeah, your group and
Yes.
Group for the East End and Nature, these groups are very vital.
Yes.
They are very vital to
You know, when a big issue comes up where there's a lot of general discussion and hearings and so forth, the arrival of a few people like Bob DeLuca makes a huge difference. They speak with the weight of numbers.
That's right.
They represent so many people, and those people are remarkably unified in what they all want.
Right.
It's an issue group. It's a group that's gathered around an issue,
Right.
and there's total agreement about it. Every time we've ever polled the membership, almost nobody disagrees with us about anything. There's a little disagreement when we say we'd really rather people wouldn't drive on the beach. Think that over for a second.
Oh, honey, I don't have to think it over. I'm from Fire Island, and when I first went to Fire Island, I've written letters about this too. When I first went to Fire Island, we'd go down to the bottom of the stairs, hail a cab, and drive down to Ocean Beach to go for dinner, because that's what was happening at that time. Well, a few hurricanes later, and we began to say, oh, wait a minute, these cars are not good for the berm of the beach, and we have to stop it. And we did. Was no longer allowed to drive on
That's
Fire Island.
simply astonishing. We've never made any, there was a whole group that was formed here, you know, a few years back.
I do know that.
And when we would stand with a clipboard at one of the beach accesses, where people came to swim and lie on the beach, they would charge up in droves and desire to sign a petition against driving on the beach because they felt endangered. They thought their children were endangered. They hated the way it made the beach look, and so on. And so we got a tremendous membership.
Listen, we had a man killed in Kismet, and we had another one who was run over, laying down on the beach. I've had it myself. Right here at Flaggy Hole one time, I was laying down on the beach, and somebody came from, you're not allowed to go west at Flaggy Hole, you're only allowed to go east. And they came from the east and went within inches of me.
Yes,
and I started screaming at them, and
well,
they,
of course you did.
and they, of course, screamed back. And unfortunately, I didn't have my phone with me. But a cop came up, and I said to that cop, those people are over there, they're not allowed to go there. You need to go and, well, he said, they'll probably, they're just fishing, they'll probably leave. And I said to him, what's your name? Because I want your name.
We do have rules.
And then he went down and did
yeah.
talk to them. Now, I didn't stay because I was just boiling mad, and I wanted to go up to my friend to make a phone call too. And I don't know if he ticketed them, but they did leave. But he should have ticketed them.
Yeah. Well, sometimes citizens have to remind the police of their duty. I've done it myself. Somebody put up a blind on the Merrill Lake Refuge, which is definitely a refuge, And I could see this across, so I called the police. And the guy came into my driveway, and I said, see over there, go get him.
Oh my God, we're over.
I can't believe it. I can't believe it. And we didn't even come. Oh God, you know what?
See, I never had it go so fast in my life.
We are too chatty. We are too chatty. There's so much.